So I'll give you the speedy rundown. I wanted to talk a little bit about being an artist during COVID, but more particularly being a disabled artist during COVID, because there are some special considerations that I think aren't being discussed enough. And I think if I can shed some light on the issues, that is good. And then I would love to answer any questions you have afterwards. And then I'm going to play a tune or two. So, my name is Gaelynn Lea. I am a violinist from Duluth, Minnesota, and a songwriter. And started playing in orchestra when I was 10. And I was really lucky because I have a disability. My arms and legs are bent and they're shorter, and I have brittle bones disease, and so I couldn't play the violin normally, like up on my shoulder. But I was just lucky. Like I didn't realize at the time it was just luck. Like the teacher that was the fifth grade orchestra teacher just happened to be like, you have a really good ear. I think you'd be good at stringed instruments. I'm going to try to help you figure out a way to play. Which, as I began touring many years later, a lot of music teachers don't say that. They say, "Oh, you can't do it. Sorry, and now you got to do better." And they don't encourage kids to adapt their instruments. And so I was lucky, and my teacher did, and I've been playing ever since. And then when I was out of school, I got out of classical music and switched over to folk and experimental and just kind of like improvisation and Celtic music and all sorts of different kinds of music. And a big change happened in 2011. I met a person named Alan Sparhawk, who's in the band Low. And Low is from Duluth, Minnesota as well, which is kind of how our paths crossed. But he formed a duo with me, and it was all improvisational instrumental music. And um, he would use a looping pedal, and he would loop my violin, and I would just play harmonies to what I heard, because harmony is my jam. Like that's what I'm best at doing. And so he would do that, and we had this project. But one day he came over and he gave me a looping pedal and an amp, and he's like, "Here you go. You need to figure out how to do this on your own. Someday you're gonna perform by yourself." And I was like, "Haha, crazy! I'm never gonna do that." But then it was really fun, and I loved looping, and I did end up performing by myself, and actually I started writing songs. I think because of the looping pedal, it gave me this freedom to explore music in a totally new way, and I started writing music kind of out of the blue at age 27. I had never written anything before that, um, and in 2016, I entered NPR Music's Tiny Desk contest, which um, there were 6,000 submissions, and you send in a video of you playing an original song in front of a desk, and that's the only rules. And so I submitted a song. I'll do it later today, probably. And it won, which was very surprising. I'm from Duluth and just like a fiddle teacher, playing local shows. Had never ever toured in my whole life. But the very first show that we did for the Tiny Desk after the video was recorded was in Chicago, and that's where I met Martin. I Bob Boylan knows Martin, and he had him on a panel, and Martin was talking about his book, and I was like, "Hey, I want to tour now because I just won this thing, and I kind of think it'd be fun to try touring." And Martin's like, "Okay, well, take it easy, go one slow step at a time." And then I was like, "Can I read your book front to back?" And it was amazing. So if you haven't read his first book, is the first one Tour Smart, right? And the second one's Band Smart, correct?
Because, yeah,
Yes.
Band Smart's
Yep.
got some good stuff and it's free from my website right now. But what I said,
But Tour
yeah,
Smart's the one
what
I
I
read.
said to you, Gavin, was
Yeah.
by all that's holy, do not tour. Yeah.
Yeah, basically. He said, "Don't go in full time." And I said, "Well, I think we might sell our house and tour full time." And he's like, "Are you sure you want to do that?" And I was like, "Yeah, I'm pretty sure." So we did that. And Paul and I toured, and it's always been very DIY. I never got signed to a label or had a manager or anything like that. And there's pros and cons to everything, but I'm kind of a little mini Martin in my heart, I think, and I really like troubleshooting, and so it's something that I like took his spreadsheets and adapted them to my own, and I just like we went in full bore in 2016, and we toured for 4 years all over the country. And the more I toured, the more I learned about accessibility in the arts, and that's what I'm gonna primarily talk to you about today. It was just, I kind of think when you grow up playing in your own town, you think, oh, well, maybe my town's not accessible, but surely these other venues are, or surely these other people are aware of this issue, and you start to realize that it's a global problem, actually. Accessibility is a global thing. And so we toured for 4 years, and then, of course, the pandemic hit, and so um, that kind of put an end to all the live shows. I mean, they all got canceled and everything started transitioning online. And so, real quick, before I get too far into the accessibility part, just a side note is what we've been doing to sustain ourselves at home. I think you always have to multitask as an artist, and Martin said that again and again. But now it's even more true. Like, I'm saying yes to every little tiny festival that's online, and like trying to do voiceovers and all the little things that people send my way, because I think at this point in time it's too early to tell what's going to end up working. I also have a Patreon page, which has been a huge lifesaver. I started it a year before because I want to write a book eventually about the last 3 years that we've been 4 years now that we've been on the road as a disabled artist. I want to write about that. And so I had started this Patreon, and I had no idea that it would end up being like how we pay our rent, like actually right now. Because like right now we're not touring, and it was a huge godsend basically to have that. And then the idea of thinking of different ways to engage. If there's a skill set that you have that you can share, it's almost like it's never been easier to create a platform, right? Like you have this conference online, you think maybe 60 people will come, and now you have 400, Martin, or 700, or whatever. The registration number is huge. It's a good time to be creating, and if you're on the front end of this curve, um, the world is definitely going to change, and I'm going to talk a little bit about how I think some of these changes are going to be really positive for people with disabilities, but the world is going to change, and if you're on the front end of it rather than the back end of it, you'll have all these skills already set in place when the world starts kind of getting back out into the in-person stuff. I started touring. I planned my first tour 6 months before it actually happened. So the other thing you could be doing with this time is starting to plan, how are you going to do your next tour, and start thinking ahead. Like I have a booking assistant that I hired, a PR assistant that I hired, and like I have all these spreadsheets down. And so I think that there's a lot of advanced planning we could be doing for when the quarantines are over, and when people do eventually start getting back on the road. You could be one of the first artists ready to do that. So if anybody does want some information or like examples of the templates that I use for hiring people, you can obviously talk to Martin, but I also have my own little set that I use for myself, and I love to share that information. So email me at gaelynn@gaelynlee.com, and I will send you kind of how we plan our tours. The other thing I'm thinking about while we're home is just how to stay in people's minds. Recording at home is something that I had never actually done because I felt like, well, I'll leave the recording part to the professionals, but obviously I'm not going to be going into the studio for a very long time, and so I upgraded enough equipment on the cheap end, but like still good enough to do real recording at home, and that's what I'm going to be working on for creatively, is getting recordings out there. And so, yeah, there's so many things we could be doing, and that's the one thing I've been grateful. I don't know if you feel this way, Martin, but even despite ups and downs and like the depression that's kind of reared its head occasionally here, I mean, there's a lot of changes and it's definitely hard, but I love being a creative person because a home time like this, I will never get bored. Like, there are so many projects to do. It's actually a little overwhelming, and I have to scale it back and be like, okay, what am I going to do right now? Instead of like, oh my gosh, there's like 1,000 projects I could pursue. And so there's a lot that you can do if you're creative and doing it at home, and it helps to keep you focused and grounded, and gives you some way to put your energy and stress into, that's positive. And so, yeah, so being an things that I think are most important for you at home to know is that just keep abreast of disability issues. Like, kind of know what is going on. If you if you can, I will put in the links. I'll put in the comments after I'm done some places you can follow to kind of keep up. And if you find out that your state is presenting these really discriminatory policies, you can call your senators. That's what I did. There's places that you can follow up. And then the other thing is you if you do need a job and you have to get out, something like Instacart is a lifesaver for me. Like I don't go grocery shopping anymore, and I am so grateful to the people that do delivery jobs. I like give them the biggest tip that I possibly can, and I say thank you like 8,000 times because I don't want to. As I said, I don't feel like I would fare well if I got COVID. A little tiny bit more background on that is when I was 21, I had respiratory failure. So they didn't know why. It turned out I had undiagnosed asthma and they didn't know it. So I went in not being able to breathe. My oxygen level was low. Very similar things that what would actually happen if I had COVID, right? So I went in. The doctor came in. I was unconscious, but my mother was there. And he took one look at me and said, "Oh, she's so small. There's nothing I'm going to be able to do. You should say your goodbyes." And that's what he told my parents. And so luckily my mom had the presence of mind to be like, she has bone disorder. That seems unreasonable to just write her off immediately. So she got a second opinion, and that doctor said, well, if any patients I saw had those symptoms, I would prescribe prednisone. And he's done that though, right? Obviously. And she's like, no, no, he hasn't done anything. So she got this other doctor to prescribe prednisone, and I recovered 24 hours later. But discrimination does exist in the healthcare system, especially when people don't understand, which is something I truly believe at the bottom of my soul is that disability is not inherently a negative thing. We're all going to get old and we're going to die, right? Our life, our health is not going to be optimal for our entire life. And so disability to me is not like a good, bad, you have it, you don't. It's a spectrum. And it's not positive or negative. It's just the way you present in the world. Some people are male, female, trans. Some people are different ethnic backgrounds. Some people are short, tall. Like, I mean, I personally feel disability is just another form of diversity, and that a lot of good comes in the world when you support all forms of diversity, including disability, rather than seeing it as inherently negative. But unfortunately, a lot of doctors don't see any diversity in health as positive, right? And so they just automatically write it off as, well, that person's life must be terrible. I'm going to work to save someone's life who is quote unquote or valuable or normal or whatever it is. But disability is diversity. So for me, every life really matters. I want to talk a little bit before we get to questions. Specifically, my identity as a disabled person, like I have so many interests, right? Like I love music, I love languages, I have a lot of friends and family that are really dear to me. Disability doesn't consume my whole life, but when I started touring, I realized that it is a true part of my identity, and I didn't realize how much I cared about like making sure the world understands this idea of disability as diversity. Um, the accessibility in the arts piece is kind of how I want to end my talk before we get to questions, because as I started touring, I realized that I think there's two reasons people like Martin who care, who give a crap. Like Martin actually cares about these issues, and he probably would have cared 30 years ago if he had realized they were a problem, right? I mean, I would hope so. I'm guessing that you would have. The thing is a lot of people don't realize there are so many barriers for people with disabilities. Like they think, oh, there's curb cuts, everything's fine. But then they get deeper into the situation and they realize that, oh, venues aren't accessible. Oh, there's job discrimination. Oh, people with disabilities are like way more likely to be in poverty. Oh, people with disabilities are way more likely to be sexually abused. There's a lot of real, real social inequalities still active regarding disabled people, right? Like, so our society has not done a great job of truly enforcing the ADA so that people with disabilities can live a life that's totally equal. We just haven't been enforcing it. And I started wondering, why is that, right? Like, why doesn't anyone else know all these things that I face on a daily basis unless I talk about them, right? Like, why is it that they just like are floored when they realize how inaccessible the world is. Doesn't anybody know that, you know? And I realized there's two things going on. One is that disability education is not taught in schools. I can't see all of your hands right now, but I know just from all the conferences I've done, people don't learn about it K through 12. Some people learn about it in college because they major in disability studies or they go into vocational rehab or social work, but a lot of people don't do those fields, right? They need to be learning about it K through 12 so that we are aware of the barriers that still exist and also talking about solutions to fixing them. And we're not doing that. As a society, overwhelmingly, people are not learning about disability history, disability rights. When you're bored someday, Google the symbol for sit-ins or watch the movie Crip Camp. Crip Camp, I cried through the whole thing basically, I think, but it's made by the Michelle and Barack Obama have a film uh, production company called Higher Ground, and they put out their first film was Crip Camp, and it's about a camp for kids with disabilities that ended up producing some of the leading disability rights advocates, and it talks about their journey from being teenagers at this radical punk camp. I mean, this camp, Martin, you would have loved that camp. I would have loved that camp. Everybody would have loved that camp. It's like this punk kind of like fringe camp that inspired kids to go and change the world. It's such a beautiful film, and we didn't learn about that stuff in school. You have to learn about it outside of school right now, which is a shame. The other thing is that we don't see disability depicted in our culture enough. So the reason I care so much about accessibility in the arts is partly I want other artists not to have to face the same crap that I do all the time. It's really hard and it's frustrating, and also technically not legal either. There's a lot of issues going on where we need to be more inclusive in the art, right? So it's frustrating, and I want more disabled artists to do it easier, but also I want people to see disabled artists so that they actually us when they're doing more boring things like hiring their next secretary. Like, you know what I mean? Like, we need to have disability as part of the culture that's really represented so that we can be in people's minds as a part of society that matters and counts and needs to be included. And I think the culture is a big way to shape it. I mean, we can't deny that we are all here because we believe that culture has power to change the world. And I think disability is a part of that, the culture. So there's five things I think that would make the arts more accessible, and then I'll turn it over to questions. The first is that I think educating kids how to play music with disabilities. Those kids need the chance to learn. As I said, I had a cool teacher. She helped me learn, but a lot of people get told, no, you can't do this. That's not how you hold a violin. You can't hold your bow that way. Educate kids. This goes for any kind of music education. I mean, Wendy, I don't know how much you're working with. There's a recording studio out of Chicago that had been started designed primarily for blind musicians so that they could like navigate the studio. There's a lot of cool things happening, but any arts organization could be incorporating disabled kids into their work. It doesn't have to just be a disabled kid art group. It can be any group, right? The next piece is community holding any kind of festival, any kind of community choir, any kind of open mic, bare minimum, and in 2020, make sure that place is accessible. Make sure people can get in the door and use the bathroom and get to the stage. I mean, we're in 2020. The law has been around for 30 years. I always ask people how many of you have moved houses in the last 30 years? Most people raise their hands. Most people don't live in the same house for 50 years. A few people do, right? But most don't. And I always say, if you have moved in the last to better suit your needs, businesses can move. If they're not able to afford the accommodations that they need, if they can't afford that elevator, I get it. Elevators are like 100 grand. They could start looking for a more accessible space to operations in. I know there's nostalgia involved with like, oh, we've been here since 1847, but in reality, be inclusive. 20% of the population has some sort of disability. That's a lot of money. It's a lot of money. Those can be your customers. And if you say, hey, customers, we care about you, we want to be inclusive, and we're going to move so that you can come to our shop, I can tell you if I were, I'd probably cry and then I would go to that business. Like, not that hard. The bar is so low right now for inclusion in business that, like, just do it and then you'll see that people will support you. I would like to hope, and I think from what I've read in the comments, that some people here are deaf and are utilizing this ASL service that Martin provided. Because if you advertise, hey, we have ASL, what person who used ASL wouldn't want to come to this conference as opposed to one where they won't be included in the same way? So inclusion is important. The next thing is venues. So again, if you're an artist but you're not disabled, you can still be a catalyst for change. You can choose to play only at accessible venues. That's the decision I eventually had to make, because I would be going to venues for the second or third time, and every time they would say, oh yeah, it'd be nice if we had a ramp, but we're going to lift your chair up. And finally, like the third time in, I was like, it's not going to change if I keep letting them lift my wheelchair up, which is, by the way, 300 pounds. It's a very heavy wheelchair. It's not safe for me. It's not safe for my chair. It's not safe for the staff to be doing that kind of lifting, anyways. And also, it sends a very negative message, I feel, to performers, potential performers with disabilities, if they have to watch me get put on the stage on the ground and then somebody lifts my chair up and it's a very ugly, like, non graceful affair. Unless they're Beyonce, you're probably not being carried up onto the stage. Most artists walk up the stage themselves, right? I want to be able to have the agency to go up on the stage and just perform like anybody else. And so it wasn't sending the message that I wanted. So eventually I made a rule that every place I played, a ramp to the stage, or I was going to play on the floor, because I personally don't want to have want people to have to see that. It feels like inequality. And so by playing on the floor, it's a very subtle way to point out, hey, this venue doesn't have a ramp stage, without me having to say anything or embarrass them. But the audience can tell. They're like, whoa, why isn't she on the stage? Oh, how would she even get up there? I get it. You know what I mean? That's kind of the process that happens. The other thing that you can do to make your events more accessible is things like captioning and ASL, or lyric books. There's a lot of ways. It's about these baby steps. If you're a big agency and you can afford it, you really should have ASL at all your concerts. You should have a captioner at all your. If you can afford to do that with a few VIP ticket prices, like, it's not that expensive. I personally would never make any money right now if I had ASL at every event. Unfortunately, that's just the way I would actually make $0. But whenever I play at a college and they can afford it, I definitely have them doing ASL. And then when I make more money, that's the very first thing I'll do. But there are some ways to do DIY accessibility things. A lyric book, as I said before, is very helpful. Martin and I have been talking about that forever. Oh, that's my phone. Terrible. Okay, Martin and I have been talking about a lyric book forever, and I need to get on that. But what I have done occasionally is printed my lyrics and just had a packet of lyrics printed in the back. And people who are hearing impaired or just have trouble focusing on auditory things, they have appreciated having the lyrics in front of them. The other thing you can do is a PowerPoint captions. So what you would do is you would have all the lyrics one line on a PowerPoint slideshow, and then you'd have someone in the back just clicking as you went through the lyrics. Again, this is not ADA, like, this is the way you should always do it. This is like, if you're a DIY artist and you have no money, think about how you can be creative to be accessible. That is the kind of stuff that we can all be doing. You don't have to be disabled to do any of this stuff. You can be a part of the solution, even if you're totally able-bodied. And then the last two things is, first of all, representation. As I said, 20% of people are disabled, right? That's a lot of people. 20% of the people we see in festivals or on stage are not disabled yet. And so how can we make that ratio more true to real life? I think that that's something that we can be focusing on if we're hiring our opening acts, if we're doing an art show, like all these things, try to think about diversity to include disability. And in 2020, you wouldn't have a festival of white dudes. You just wouldn't anymore. That's just not the way the world works, which is fine. I think it's good to have diversity, like, and include disability in that idea of diversity. The last thing is media. How do we talk about disabilities? The last thing I want to end on, because I believe that disability is diversity, I do not believe that it is negative. And so, therefore, when I read articles about myself that are like, she is a victim of osteogenesis imperfecta, she suffers from brittle bones disease, she's a wheelchair, these are all real terms. Or my favorite, least favorite, was didn't look like she was going to be able to do much with her life until she found music. Like, what? I was like, what? That's not accurate. Like, what are you talking about? So, the way we talk about artists with disabilities says a lot about how we feel about that disability. So, if you're a writer or if you're just making an Instagram post, whatever, think about the words you're using. They should not have negative connotations when you're talking about disability. If you have questions about how someone wants you to refer to them, it's okay to ask too. A lot of people have said, how do you want me to talk about your disability? The reason I knew NPR music people were cool is the very first day before they announced that I won, they said, how do you want us to talk about your disability? That is all you need to do. Because I'm going to tell you what I truly, like, how I feel like how I want it represented. And that's important because it's important to own a narrative when it's been maligned for generations, right? When there's been a really negative message about your existence, think about how much of a bummer it would be. And this is something that I hadn't realized until I started reading more from disability rights advocates, but it does drain on you to hear everybody talk about your life as sucking. Like, as like, suffers from this, she was never able to do this. And I'm like, well, but I actually like my life. Like, FYI, I enjoy my life. I've done a lot of really cool things, and even if I never leave our house again, I've done enough cool things already in the last 4 years that like are sustaining me for the future. Like we have done a lot of cool things and I enjoy being alive. And even people I know with different disabilities maybe aren't able to get out, they still enjoy their lives. Statistically, people with disabilities rate their quality of life as equal to anyone else. It's the people on the outside that rate their quality of life as horseshit, right? It's not us. We're not like our lives suck. It's other people saying your life must suck. And so that has to change. We need to understand that people can enjoy life in many different circumstances we don't it doesn't have to look the same. Again, disability is diversity. Diversity of lived experience is also a valuable thing. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for having me, Martin. I love you. And I love you, Randy. And I don't know you yet, Wendy, but I love you too. And everybody here is doing such good work. So